In January 1985, a winter freeze fell over London's Alexandra Palace. Sir Clive Sinclair, the engineering genius who had just put computers into millions of British bedrooms, stood before the press to reveal the future of transport. Instead of a revolution, he unveiled a small, gray plastic tricycle. This was the Sinclair C5. Priced at $309, it was assembled in a Welsh washing machine factory and sold through mail-order adverts. It was designed to replace the second family car. Instead, while 14,000 were manufactured, only a fraction sold. Within 10 months, the entire company collapsed. For the early adopters, the reality was terrifying. Drivers found themselves sitting inches from the freezing tarmac, inhaling the exhaust fumes of double-decker buses, completely exposed to the British rain. The paradox was absolute. The man who had defined British home computing had just engineered a national punchline. But the real story of the Sinclair C5 is not only the story of a plastic tricycle that failed in the snow, it is the story of how a British technology empire tried to build the micro-mobility future 30 years before the streets were ready for it. Every week, we tell the stories of British machines, platforms, software houses, and gadgets that once taught the country what the future felt like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with a transport company, but with a computing fortune in Cambridge in 1983. In 1982, Cambridge was the undisputed center of the British microcomputer boom. Sir Clive Sinclair had just released the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, a home computer that turned a generation of British children into bedroom coders. Money was flowing into Sinclair research at an unprecedented rate. The company was one of the most famous and profitable technology firms in the country. Yet the man whose name was printed on millions of plastic computer cases did not want to spend the rest of his life building calculating machines. His true obsession, nurtured since his early days as an inventor in the 1960s, was personal electric transport. The British high street and the suburban commute in the early 1980s were dominated by heavy steel, petrol, and diesel. For many households, a second family car was an expensive luxury, far beyond the reach of a typical budget. Commuting meant waiting for a double-decker bus in the freezing rain, riding a bicycle through heavy, polluted traffic, or wrestling with a noisy two-stroke moped. Sinclair looked at this landscape and believed it was fundamentally inefficient. Why burn gallons of fossil fuel to move a ton of metal just to transport a single human being 3 miles to an office or a supermarket? His ambition, internally known as the C101 project, was to build a single-person electric vehicle. However, bringing a traditional car to the British market required vast capital, rigorous crash testing, and a sprawling established dealer network. That barrier seemed insurmountable until the British government provided an accidental master key. In 1983, the UK introduced new legislation to govern a category called electrically assisted pedal cycles. The rules were highly specific. If a vehicle weighed under 60 kilograms, had an electric motor outputting no more than 250 watts, and was restricted to a top speed of 15 miles per hour, it was legally classified as a bicycle. It required no driving license. It required no road tax. It required no insurance. Most crucially, it could be legally driven on British roads by anyone over the age of 14. For Sinclair, this was not just a legal classification, it was a perfect engineering brief. He could bypass the entire traditional automotive industry. He could build a machine that fell exactly into this new legal gap, applying the same ruthless logic of miniaturization and cost-cutting he had used to democratize the home computer. He would build it small, sell it cheap, and manufacture it at an immense scale. However, designing a road vehicle is vastly different from soldering a motherboard for a desktop. Sinclair assembled an eclectic mix of British engineering heritage and household manufacturing to bring the vision to life. The chassis, the underlying structural frame that supports the vehicle, was designed in collaboration with Lotus Cars, a prestigious British manufacturer known for its lightweight Formula One racing designs. The bodywork would be made of injection-molded polypropylene. At the time, this was the largest single plastic molding of its kind in the world, chosen because it was lightweight, cheap to produce, and impossible to rust in the damp British climate. Yet the propulsion system revealed a profound disconnect between Sinclair's futuristic ambition and the available technology of the era. The electric motor, produced by an Italian company called Polymotor, was essentially derived from a design used for lorry cooling fans and industrial washing machines. To power it, Sinclair commissioned Oldham batteries to create a bespoke 12-volt lead-acid battery. Lead-acid was heavy, highly sensitive to cold temperatures, and notoriously limited in its capacity. But in 1984, long before the lithium-ion revolution, it was the only commercially viable option to keep the retail price low. And the retail price was the central pillar of the entire project. The target launch price was set at $399. In the context of 1985, this was a staggering proposition. It was roughly the price of a high-end home computer, a good quality television set, or a premium hi-fi system. Sinclair believed that at this price point, the vehicle would not just be a rich man's novelty, it would become a mass-market household appliance. To achieve this, the project needed immense manufacturing capacity. In a move that perfectly captured the bizarre nature of the enterprise, Sinclair Vehicles did not build a traditional car plant. Instead, they contracted Hoover. In the industrial town of Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales, a factory famous for churning out washing machines and vacuum cleaners was retooled to assemble the electric future. It was a bold statement of industrial intent. The Hoover factory was equipped with a production line capable of producing up to 8,000 units a week. Sinclair was not planning for a niche market of environmentalists. He was preparing for a national revolution. The distribution model was equally audacious. Sinclair intended to bypass established car dealerships entirely. Instead, he relied on the exact mechanism that had made his computing empire so profitable: mail-order adverts. In the 1980s, British consumers were accustomed to buying computers, software, and electronic components by filling out paper coupons in Sunday newspaper supplements and computer magazines, waiting weeks for a cardboard box to arrive in the post. Sinclair believed people would buy a motor vehicle in exactly the same way. A customer would cut out a coupon, post a check for $390, and a delivery lorry would eventually drop a large cardboard box containing a gray plastic tricycle outside their front door. By late 1984, the Merthyr Tydfil production line was moving. Thousands of gray polypropylene shells were being fitted with Lotus-designed chassis and washing machine motors. The media hype was building rapidly across the country. Rumors circulated that the man who had conquered the living room was about to release an electric car that would change the face of British cities forever. The public, remembering how Sinclair had successfully delivered the future in the form of the ZX81 and the Spectrum, gave him the benefit of the doubt. The blueprint was ready, the legislation was passed, and Britain was about to see what happens when computer logic tries to engineer the high street commute. When a British customer paid $391 in early 1985, they were not buying a conventional car. They were buying an entirely new category of machine, engineered with a ruthless logic that prized mathematical efficiency over traditional comfort. The Sinclair C5 was officially a tricycle, but to look at it was to see a piece of consumer electronics blown up to human scale. It was the physical manifestation of microcomputing philosophy applied to the British road. The foundation of the machine was the chassis, the underlying metal framework that gives a vehicle its structural integrity and dictates how it handles. Sinclair knew his computer engineers at Cambridge could not design a safe road frame, so he outsourced this critical component to Lotus Cars. Lotus, a revered British marque famous for its lightweight Formula One racing machines, designed a Y-shaped steel backbone. It was remarkably strong, highly rigid, and weighed almost nothing. Over this Lotus frame sat the body shell. Instead of stamped steel, Sinclair used injection-molded polypropylene, a tough, lightweight plastic commonly used in durable household products. The logic was undeniable. A plastic shell would never rust in the damp British climate. It required no expensive paint shop. It could absorb minor impacts without denting, and crucially, it could be churned out of the Hoover factory in Merthyr Tydfil by the thousands. But a vehicle is defined by its propulsion. The electric motor, the mechanism that turns electrical energy into physical movement, was sourced from an Italian manufacturer called Polymotor. It was a 250-watt unit, originally derived from a design used to drive cooling fans in large commercial vehicles. It was cheap, reliable, and exactly met the legal limit set by the British government for an electrically assisted pedal cycle. To supply this motor with power, Sinclair commissioned Oldham batteries to design a bespoke power source. The battery, the chemical storage unit that dictates how far the vehicle can travel, was a 12-volt lead-acid design, similar in chemistry to what you might find under the bonnet of a standard car, but adapted for deep, repeated discharges. Lead acid was heavy and notoriously sensitive to cold weather, but in the mid-1980s, it was the only commercially viable option to keep the retail price low. The true breakthrough, however, was not just in the manufacturing materials, but in how the human interacted with the machine. Driving a C5 was unlike driving anything else on a British road. A user did not climb into a C5. They stepped over the low plastic lip and reclined into it. The seating position was heavily raked back, placing the driver's head roughly at the height of a standard car's headlights. There was no steering wheel. Instead, the driver's hands rested naturally by their sides, gripping a set of handlebars positioned beneath their thighs. The dashboard was purely electronic, a direct nod to Sinclair's computing heritage. A strip of red and green LEDs, light-emitting diodes, served as a battery meter, displaying power levels with the same visual language as a hi-fi system or a home computer peripheral. To move, the driver simply pedaled to get the vehicle rolling, then squeezed a trigger on the handlebar. The 250-watt motor would whine into life, engaging with a small mechanical click, and the plastic shell would glide forward. There were no gears to shift, no clutch to balance, and no roaring exhaust to manage. In a quiet British suburb, the machine moved with a faint, futuristic hum. For a brief moment, cruising at 10 or 12 miles per hour on a smooth, flat road, the C5 felt exactly like the future Sinclair had promised. The engineering, however, was only half the breakthrough. The other half was the price and the access. At $399, the C5 bypassed the entire financial and bureaucratic infrastructure of car ownership. There were no dealerships to visit, no salesmen to negotiate with, no road tax to pay, and no MOT certificates to secure. Because it was legally classified as a bicycle, anyone over the age of 14 could drive it without a license. This opened up a massive, entirely new demographic. A 16-year-old on a paper round, a commuter making a short journey to the train station, or a family wanting a cheaper way to reach the local shops could simply bypass the traditional automotive market. Sinclair relied on the exact mechanism that had made his computing empire so profitable: mail-order adverts. In the 1980s, British consumers were accustomed to buying computers by filling out paper coupons in Sunday newspaper supplements and waiting weeks for a cardboard box to arrive. Sinclair believed they would buy a vehicle exactly the same way. A customer would post a check, a lorry would eventually drop a massive cardboard box at their front door, and the owner could plug their new transport directly into a standard household 3-pin socket. Sinclair was not just selling a tricycle, he was selling an ideology. The British high street was choking on traffic. Petrol prices were a constant source of national anxiety. The C5 proposed a radical alternative, a personal, pollution-free pod that cost pennies to run. It was a vision of micro-mobility that predated modern electric scooters and urban hire bikes by over 3 decades. It promised to take the noise, the weight, and the expense out of the morning commute. The machine worked perfectly on the test track. The market, however, was about to test it in the rain. By the second week of January 1985, the anticipation surrounding Sinclair vehicles had reached a national fever pitch. The British press knew that Sir Clive Sinclair, operating out of his Cambridge design offices, was about to unveil something intended to shift the paradigm of travel. When the launch event finally took place at Alexandra Palace in London, it was not treated as a standard corporate press conference. It was broadcast and covered as a major cultural milestone. Britain, still navigating the heavy industrial decline and economic friction of the mid-1980s, was looking for a technological victory. Sinclair, the man who had already conquered the living room and the school desk, was offering one. To understand the scale of the optimism in that moment, one must understand the cultural gravity of the Sinclair brand. Just 3 years earlier, the ZX Spectrum had transformed the concept of computing from an intimidating, room-sized industrial tool into a friendly, rubber-keyed object that sat on a bedroom desk. Sinclair had taught the British public to trust the miniaturization of the future. The public assumption was simple. If Sinclair's engineers could compress an entire arcade machine's worth of processing power into a plastic wedge for under 200 pounds, surely they could compress a motor car into a cheap electric tricycle. The ambition was backed by astonishing industrial momentum. Deep in the valleys of South Wales, the Hoover factory in Merthyr Tydfil had been entirely transformed. The production lines that traditionally churned out white goods and washing machines for the British high street were now dominated by a sea of injection-molded gray polypropylene. Hundreds of workers were assembling the Lotus-designed chassis, wiring the Italian polymotor units, and fitting the heavy Oldham lead-acid batteries. The facility was theoretically tooled to produce up to 8,000 vehicles a week. This was not a limited-run novelty for eccentric collectors. Sinclair Vehicles was building an infrastructure designed to replace the petrol engine on a national scale. The marketing campaign matched the manufacturing hubris. Sinclair bypassed traditional automotive journalism and went directly to the consumer through aggressive, full-page mail-order adverts in Sunday newspaper supplements and heavy rotation on British television networks. The adverts presented the C5 not as a bicycle, but as a sleek, futuristic space pod gliding silently past heavy traffic. They targeted teenagers wanting independence, housewives needing to carry groceries from the supermarket, and commuters exhausted by the rising costs of petrol and rail fares. All a customer had to do was fill out a paper coupon, write a check for $319, and post it off to a distribution center. For the early adopters, the arrival of the machine felt like the beginning of a new era. A heavy goods lorry would pull into a quiet, semi-detached British suburb and unload a massive white cardboard box onto the driveway. Inside was a fully assembled vehicle, completely bypassing the intimidating dealership networks, the haggling, and the paperwork of traditional car ownership. The user simply lifted it out, plugged the heavy 12-volt battery into a standard household 3-pin socket, and waited for it to charge. In a British suburb where the second family car was still an expensive luxury, the C5 did not merely offer a cheap motor. It offered a vision where the future of personal transport belonged not to massive steel and petrol, but to quiet, affordable, electric plastic running from a household plug. For a fleeting window in the spring of 1985, looking at the sheer volume of units rolling off the Welsh assembly line and the blanket advertising across the country, it seemed as though Sinclair had successfully engineered a revolution. The brand had captured the nation's attention, convincing thousands to buy a vehicle without ever taking a test drive. But attention, on a busy, rain-swept British road, was about to become the C5's most fatal flaw. The sheer scale of Sinclair's ambition was most visible not in a showroom, but on the factory floor in Merthyr Tydfil. By early 1985, Hoover's production line was running at an astonishing pace, ultimately manufacturing roughly 14,000 units. The operation was a marvel of supply chain logistics, combining Lotus-designed steel frameworks, Italian polymotor units, and massive polypropylene moldings into a single shippable box. At the Hoover plant, the assembly of the C5 was a surreal collision of eras. Workers who had spent decades building domestic white goods were now bolting racing-engineered axles to electric motors, dropping heavy lead-acid batteries into plastic bays. The sheer speed of production was a testament to the simplicity of the design. There were no complex gearboxes to calibrate, no exhaust systems to fit, and no fuel lines to test. It was a chassis, a shell, a motor, and a battery. This simplicity was supposed to be its greatest strength, the very reason it could be manufactured in such staggering numbers, bypassing the slow, heavily unionized, and expensive traditional British car industry. To move this massive inventory, Sinclair Vehicles launched an unprecedented marketing and retail expansion, backed by a $3 million advertising budget. While mail-order coupons and the Sunday supplements were the primary engine, the company knew the public needed to touch the plastic and see the electronics in person. In a move that perfectly illustrated Force 2, retail and access, they partnered with the electrical retail chain Comet. This was a profound psychological positioning. By placing the C5 in Comet shops across the high street, alongside washing machines, CRT televisions, and Amstrad hi-fi systems, Sinclair was telling the British public that this was not a complex, dangerous motor vehicle requiring a mechanic or a dealership. It was a consumer electronic appliance. You bought it, you plugged it in, and it worked. Sinclair even attempted to build a supplementary ecosystem around the vehicle, recognizing that a hardware platform needs accessories to thrive. Through the mail-order catalogs, buyers could purchase custom C5 side mirrors, high-visibility safety masks to make the low-slung vehicle easier to spot, specially designed mud flaps, and even branded weatherproof clothing. It was a complete consumer package, designed with the same modular logic as buying a memory expansion pack or a new rubber-keyed joystick for a home computer. The strategy was clear. Get the base hardware onto the driveway, then sell the upgrades. The cultural penetration was absolute. The C5 was everywhere in the British media. It was driven through the studios of the BBC's Blue Peter, demonstrating the future of transport to millions of children and their parents. It appeared on Wogan, where the sight of the gray tricycle rolling onto the set cemented its status as a national talking point. It was debated in the Times, discussed on local radio phone-ins, and featured in computer magazines that usually reserve their pages for software reviews. At that specific moment, Sir Clive Sinclair appeared untouchable. He was the man who had dragged the British classroom into the digital age, and now he was dragging the British commuter away from the petrol pump. For the early buyers, unpacking the massive white box in a suburban driveway felt like opening a crate from the 21st century. The C5, when driven in ideal conditions, on a flat, quiet estate, on a dry afternoon, delivered a glimpse of what micro-mobility could be. The driver sat low in the aerodynamic shell, pressing the trigger, moving silently at 15 miles per hour. There was a sense of weightlessness, a quiet technological triumph over the noisy, polluting mopeds and heavy cars of the era. The LED dashboard blinked green, the battery hummed, and the future felt entirely solved. Sinclair was so confident in this breakthrough that the C5 was already being treated internally as a stepping stone. The Cambridge design offices were quietly conceptualizing the C10 and the C15, larger enclosed electric cars that would eventually replace the family saloon. The plastic tricycle was supposed to be the cash cow that funded a total revolution of the British road network. The ecosystem of manufacturing, high street retail, and public trust seemed perfectly aligned to change the country forever. The blueprint was perfect. The factory was fully operational, and the Comet showrooms were stocked. But the C5 was about to be driven out of the television studio and onto a real, freezing British road. The first crack in the Sinclair C5 empire was not a catastrophic mechanical failure or a sudden factory strike. The first crack was simply the weather. When the vehicle officially launched in January 1985, Britain was gripped by freezing temperatures and heavy snow. Sinclair had engineered the machine in the sterile, controlled environment of a Cambridge design office and tested it on smooth private tracks. But a consumer transport ecosystem does not survive on a test track. It survives on the cold, unforgiving tarmac of the British high street. The immediate problem was the power source. The battery, the bespoke 12-volt lead-acid cell manufactured by Oldham, was inherently sensitive to temperature. Lead-acid chemistry dictates that when the temperature drops, the chemical reactions inside the battery slow down. In the freezing British winter, the C5's battery capacity effectively halved. Sinclair's marketing adverts had promised a range of 20 miles on a single charge. In reality, a commuter driving in the January snow, constantly engaging the 250-watt motor to combat the cold and the slush, might find the battery dying after just 5 miles. When the battery died, the driver was left pedaling a heavy plastic tricycle that weighed 45 kilograms. It was exhausting, humiliating, and entirely impractical. But the battery was only the technical failure. The cultural failure was the sheer terror of driving it. To understand why the C5 collapsed, one must understand Force 4, global scale, American standards, and convenience displacement. In the technology market, convenience does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be better than the alternative. Sinclair believed the C5 would displace the bicycle and the second family car. But a traditional bicycle, while requiring physical effort, did not cost $399, did not run out of battery, and could be easily lifted over a curb. A cheap second-hand car, perhaps a rusty Ford Fiesta or a battered Mini, might cost more to run, but it possessed a roof, a heater, and steel doors. The C5 offered none of these conveniences. In a British user scene, driving the vehicle meant reclining just a few inches above the ground. The driver's head was positioned precisely at the height of a lorry's hubcaps. Because the vehicle had no roof and no side doors, the driver was completely exposed to the rain, the freezing wind, and the deafening noise of heavy traffic. In a bustling city center or on a congested suburban roundabout, sitting in a C5 meant breathing in the direct exhaust fumes of double-decker buses and idling diesel vans. The media, which had built Sir Clive Sinclair into a national hero just weeks earlier, immediately turned on the machine. Journalists who were invited to test drive the C5 in the freezing snow did not write about the brilliance of the Lotus chassis or the efficiency of the polymotor. They wrote about feeling invisible to other motorists. They wrote about the terrifying vulnerability of sitting in a plastic shell while heavy goods vehicles roared past. Almost overnight, a national safety panic erupted. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents, a highly influential British institution, publicly expressed severe doubts about the vehicle's safety on public roads. They pointed out that its low profile made it nearly impossible for lorry drivers to see in their rearview mirrors. Sinclair attempted to counter this by selling a high-visibility mast, a tall pole with a red flag that could be bolted to the back of the shell. But the damage to the brand was already done. The C5 was no longer viewed as the futuristic transport of tomorrow. It was rapidly being framed as an expensive, dangerous toy. This shift in public perception triggered Force 1: hardware, software, supply chains, and manufacturing costs. The C5 project had been built on a model of immense scale. The Hoover factory in Merthyr Tydfil was tooled to assemble up to 8,000 vehicles a week. Sinclair Vehicles had ordered millions of pounds worth of components: chassis from Lotus, motors from Italy, batteries from Oldham, and massive quantities of injection-molded polypropylene. The entire economic model relied on thousands of checks arriving in the post every week from the Sunday newspaper adverts. But as the safety warnings dominated the headlines and the winter weather exposed the battery's flaws, the mail-order coupons stopped arriving. The British public, who had happily bought ZX Spectrums unseen for magazine adverts, suddenly realized that a motor vehicle was not a computer. A family might risk £100 on a bedroom coding machine, but they would not risk $399 on a plastic tricycle that safety experts were warning against. In a desperate bid to move the stockpiling inventory, Sinclair relied heavily on their retail partnership with Comet. The high-street electronics shops were suddenly filled with gray tricycles sitting awkwardly between televisions and washing machines. But this retail presence only accelerated the decline. When potential buyers actually sat in the C5 in a Comet showroom, they realized just how small, low, and exposed it truly was. The futuristic illusion created by the television adverts evaporated upon physical contact. By the spring of 1985, the massive production lines in South Wales were beginning to stall. The factory had built the future, but the British public was rapidly deciding they did not want to drive it. The collapse of the Sinclair C5 was not a slow fade. It was an industrial hard stop. By the summer of 1985, the massive production lines at the Hoover factory in Merthyr Tydfil, designed to churn out up to 8,000 units a week, were drowning in unsold inventory. Force 1, hardware, supply chains, and manufacturing costs began to crush the company. A business model built on the assumption of continuous, massive mail order volume cannot survive when the warehouses are full of injection-molded plastic and the public stops writing checks. The retail ecosystem panicked first. Comet, the high-street electronics chain that had partnered with Sinclair to give the machine physical presence, suddenly found its showrooms clogged with expensive, unsellable tricycles. To clear valuable floor space for televisions, Amstrad hi-fi systems, and videocassette recorders, Comet began aggressively slashing the price. A machine that had launched in January at $399 was soon being quietly offered for $139, then even less. This rapid devaluation was fatal for the brand. The C5 was no longer perceived as a revolutionary piece of micromobility. It was visibly failing, reduced to the status of a discounted high-street novelty. The ecosystem of accessories collapsed simultaneously. The mail-order catalogs offering high-visibility masks, custom side mirrors, and weatherproof capes were quietly withdrawn. There is no market for upgrades when the base platform has been rejected by the public. The C5 had required a critical mass of users to normalize its presence on the British road. It needed network effects, the pattern where a product becomes more valuable, or in this case, socially acceptable and physically safer as more people use it. If there had been thousands of C5s in every British city, drivers of heavy vehicles would have learned to look out for them. But because so few were on the roads, the early adopters remained vulnerable, isolated anomalies, terrified of being crushed by a passing lorry. The financial strain of the C5 project quickly became a contagion that infected the rest of Sir Clive Sinclair's empire. The $3 million advertising budget and the immense manufacturing commitments at the Welsh factory drained the cash reserves of a company that was simultaneously struggling in the home computer market. Sinclair Research, the computing arm, was already facing difficulties with the delayed and buggy Sinclair QL business computer. While rivals like Amstrad were aggressively taking over the British high street, the electric vehicle division did not just fail in isolation, it mortally wounded the computing giant that had birthed it. By August 1985, just 8 months after the freezing launch event at Alexandra Palace, Hoover officially halted the Merthyr Tydfil production line. Out of the projected hundreds of thousands of units, only about 14,000 had been manufactured. Only a fraction of those had actually been sold to the public at full retail price. The final chapter of Sinclair Vehicles was a bleak exercise in corporate liquidation. On the 12th of October 1985, the company was officially placed into receivership. It was a humiliating public defeat. Sir Clive Sinclair, the visionary who had taught a generation of British children to code, was forced to watch his grandest ambition dismantled by accountants. In the months that followed, he was forced to sell the Sinclair computer brand and its intellectual property to his bitterest high street rival, Alan Sugar's Amstrad, just to save his own finances. The physical aftermath of the C5 was equally undignified. Thousands of unsold, gray plastic machines were bought up by liquidation firms at rock-bottom prices. They were scattered to the wind. Some were sold off for less than $50. Hundreds were exported to the Middle East and the United States, not as serious transport, but as bizarre recreational toys. In Britain, small fleets of them ended up at coastal holiday camps, rented out to children for a few pence a ride to trundle around concrete courtyards. The machine that was supposed to replace the second family car had become a seaside amusement. The factory lines stopped. The Comet showrooms cleared the floor. The mail-order adverts vanished from the Sunday papers. The British commuter went back to the petrol pump. The company collapsed. The logo became a punchline. The electric dream was gone. The collapse of Sinclair Vehicles in October 1985 marked the end of an extraordinary era of unchecked British technological hubris. The corporate entity died, completely humiliated on the national stage. Sir Clive Sinclair, the visionary who had put the ZX Spectrum into millions of bedrooms and taught a generation to code, saw his reputation severely and permanently bruised. To survive the financial ruin brought on by the electric vehicle disaster, he was forced to sell his beloved computer business to his fierce high street rival, Alan Sugar of Amstrad. The Sinclair brand, once synonymous with Cambridge engineering brilliance, was diluted into a badge slapped onto Amstrad's budget cassette machines and rebranded computers. Yet Sir Clive Sinclair never actually repented. He never admitted that the fundamental concept of the C5 was wrong. He maintained until his passing decades later that the internal combustion engine was a ridiculous way to move a single human being across a city. In the 1990s, he even tried again with the Sinclair Zeek, a lightweight electric bicycle, which also failed to capture the market. He was stubbornly, relentlessly convinced that personal transport had to shrink, and he refused to let the market's rejection change his mind. Today, the Sinclair C5 has a strange, vibrant afterlife in British preservation culture. It has long since moved from a high street embarrassment to a coveted collector's item. You can find pristine examples preserved in the National Motor Museum at Beaulieu, or carefully curated behind glass at the Centre for Computing History in Cambridge. But the true legacy of the machine does not live in static museum displays. It lives in the active, highly dedicated enthusiast communities across the United Kingdom. In garages and workshops from Manchester to London, A thriving subculture of C5 owners refuses to let the gray plastic shells die. They trade spare parts, patch the Lotus-designed chassis, and source replacement polymotor belts. Most importantly, they fix the exact engineering bottleneck that killed the vehicle in 1985, the battery. Modern collectors routinely rip out the heavy, cold-sensitive Oldham lead-acid batteries and replace them with modern, lightweight lithium-ion power packs. When upgraded with 21st-century chemical storage, the Sinclair C5 suddenly behaves exactly as the 1985 television adverts promised. It becomes fast, reliable, and capable of covering dozens of miles on a single charge without stranding its driver in the freezing rain. But looking at a heavily modified C5 is not an exercise in retro computing nostalgia. The legacy of this machine passes a much more profound historical test. To understand why the C5 matters today, you only have to look at the traffic outside any modern British high street shop, office building, or university campus. The roads are crowded with electric bicycles. The pavements are lined with dockless, app-controlled electric scooters. Delivery riders weave through city traffic on battery-powered tricycles, carrying groceries in insulated boxes. The urban transport landscape is completely defined by micro-mobility, the exact category of transport that Sir Clive Sinclair tried to invent 30 years too early. Sinclair was absolutely right about the disease. He correctly identified that burning gallons of fossil fuel to move a heavy steel box 2 miles down the road was an inefficient, polluting, and unsustainable habit. He was right that the future of the urban commute belonged to electric motors, lightweight frames, and household charging. He simply offered the medicine before the patient, and the infrastructure was ready. In 1985, Britain did not have dedicated cycle lanes to separate a low-slung plastic tricycle from a roaring double-decker bus. It did not have lithium-ion batteries that could survive a freezing January morning. And most crucially, it did not have a consumer culture willing to abandon the safety, warmth, and status of the private motor car for an exposed, aerodynamic pod. The market wanted convenience, and in the 1980s, convenience still meant petrol and a steel roof. The surprise footnote of the C5 story is that the underlying engineering was actually remarkably sound. In recent years, extreme engineering enthusiasts have taken the original Y-shaped Lotus chassis, fitted it with modern high-voltage electric motors, and pushed the little gray tricycle to speeds exceeding 80 miles per hour on closed tracks. It turns out the frame was brilliant. The aerodynamics were highly efficient. The plastic shell was incredibly durable. The only thing missing was the modern ecosystem required to support it. The Sinclair C5 remains a monument to a specific type of British technological tragedy. It proves that invention is never enough on its own. A product can be logically perfect, legally clever, and backed by a national manufacturing empire, yet still collapse entirely if the market is not ready to change its daily habit. Britain did not lack the vision to see the electric future. It just lacked the patience to wait for the technology to catch up with the dream. Somewhere in a British garage under a heavy canvas tarp, a gray plastic Sinclair C5 sits quietly on its 3 wheels. A ridiculed machine that simply arrived 30 years before the streets were ready for it. See you in the next one.